I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're diving into the untold stories of America's past with an amazing author. His name is Brad Bondhus. He has penned a powerful book. It is called History Uncovered, Revealing Hidden Truths. This thought-provoking book explores how historical narratives are shaped, questioning who controls the story and why certain details are omitted. If you're curious about the lesser-known facets of U.S. history and their impact on our nation today, this is a book that will open your eyes. This is a conversation that will open your eyes to the hidden truths of America's story. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank our team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. Brad, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Glad to be with you.
During your research, is there one standout fact, story, circumstance, or situation about the United States of America that surprised you and you feel few people actually know about?
And I would say this wasn't research. I stumbled on it. I was watching a special on the History Channel, The Secret History of the KKK. And in that documentary, they were talking about how Woodrow Wilson had resegregated the federal government. And I think it was Thanksgiving night in 1915, the KKK was resurrected. Now, I was growing up in the 60s during the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, and I wasn't actively involved, but I witnessed that. And I thought to myself, how could we not have been talking about that fact that Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government in the early 1900s? And that just kind of blew me away. So I went and talked to a neighbor, a black fellow about 20 years older than I, and asked him about it. He had previously told me of his activities in local civil rights protests here in Maryland, and he knew nothing about it either. I figured if I might not know, but he would certainly know. Well, he didn't know. So how is that hidden?
Yeah. How are they hidden? Do you think they're purposely hidden by academia and society? Is it part of systemic racism that something like that is not pointed out, but instead buried?
I believe so, yes. In fact, I think our ability to discover things is evolving now that we've got the electronic age, and people are finding more and more access to information. But I think there were a number of things. One reason they couldn't announce that is because to resegregate the federal government, it had to have been desegregated already. And that happened under Teddy Roosevelt. He was working with Booker T. Washington, looking for capable black candidates for federal positions. And he had put numerous people into the federal government. And that continued under William Howard Taft. And then Wilson came in and he segregated the federal government. So you can't talk about Roosevelt, what he did, if you don't talk about Wilson.
Right.
So you don't talk about either of those aspects. Both of them supported big government. Both of them had big plans, but you can't talk about desegregating the federal government because then you'd have to talk about resegregating the federal government. And I think there's another aspect of the history at that time. And I first heard about this in a documentary called Moffat 21, which is on YouTube. But I also found an article later on that confirmed it, which was out of the Harvard Review. And in the Harvard Review article, this was 2016, they were talking about how the academics, particularly Harvard, but throughout many other institutions, were promoting eugenics. Now, for those who aren't familiar, eugenics started in England it was started by a cousin of Charles Darwin. It was part of the evolutionary thought. And it ended up being the science that the Nazis were following. And I think that was another reason why Wilson's history was hidden.
Fascinating. What made you decide to write a book, History Uncovered, and reveal these hidden truths?
Well, I decided it was time to no longer be angry about things that I had heard, things that, we hadn't been taught, things that I believed have been hidden, and try and get more out in the public. And you're seeing it through a lot of different sites. There are a lot of people promoting it. But, where I see people talking about it is they're saying, well, this fact was hidden before. And I thought I'd like to think a little more deeply about why they would try and hide those details.
Yeah. Particularly
in the
school
case,
children, we're taught such just basic information about our leaders. If you look back on what, George Washington had cherry pie and would never tell a lie and had wooden false teeth. You learn just such little innocuous anecdotes about each president, particularly in the primary grades, and not much more in high school either. So part of it's a failing of academia and our educational system, don't you think?
well, I think there's a narrative that's being told, and you have to craft it for the audience that you're projecting it to. So
Right.
you can't get into a lot of detail for grade school and high school. There's limitations as to how much you can teach. But I would say when I was going through school in the 60s, it was taught that, slavery existed at the founding of the country because we had been a British colony, and numerous British monarchs said slavery was acceptable. In fact, 2 colonies tried to abolish it, and the king said no.
Hmm.
But we knew that, and we also were taught that it was a very contentious issue because you've got this new idea of governance, self-rule, freedom, yet slavery, and they were inconsistent.
Yeah.
And that we knew in the 60s, but I don't think the kids nowadays are being taught that.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of your other discoveries or findings that you think would be of interest to our viewers. We talked about Woodrow Wilson and the fact that he resegregated the government. What are what are 1 or 2 other things that you found during your research that you found quite eye-raising or fascinating?
Well, I would let's stay on Woodrow Wilson for a minute.
Mhm.
A few years ago, it was very controversial to sing the national anthem, and I was really surprised to find out at that time that the national anthem wasn't adopted until the 1930s
Hmm.
as an official act. Because as a kid, we had been taught, well, there's the War of 1812, the Battle of Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key, and the Star Spangled Banner, and they all kind of lumped together. And so I had always assumed that the Star Spangled Banner started way back when. Well, and I also assumed it only had 1 verse because we never sang the other verses that are considered controversial nowadays.
Hmm.
Well, Woodrow Wilson, by executive order, directed that the Star Spangled Banner be played at military functions. Now, there were other people at the time also looking for a national anthem, and I think this was part of a movement to bring America up in stature in the world. And some people wanted the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but I don't think that would have been acceptable to people in the South who had been defeated 40 years earlier. And there's a song, "O Columbia." I've heard the title, I've never heard the song. Well, Woodrow Wilson, interestingly, is the only American president to have been a citizen of the Confederacy.
Hmm.
As a young boy, he was born right before the Civil War started.
Hmm.
But I'm sure his parents' thoughts influenced his impressions on the world.
Yeah.
But he issued it as a presidential directive. But at the same time, a fellow named Charles Linthicum, a representative, introduced a bill into Congress that was not passed and adopted until 1932.
Hmm.
And that bill would make the Star Spangled Banner the national anthem. Now,
Amazing.
I was a little surprised when I found that out, because I've worked in Baltimore, Maryland, right near the airport, BWI Airport, for nearly, 42 years. And it happens that the address there is Linthicum. And it turns out that the fellow who promoted that as the national anthem, his family plantation was right there. And after the Civil War, it was developed into that community.
Hmm. Amazing. Amazing. Do you plan on following up this book with more hidden truths? Tell us about your writing career a little bit.
Well, yeah, I do. I do think there are more that need to be explored, because I think, what we've touched on here are some of the details that have been hidden. But I think we need to look into more how the elites of the country have used the system to their benefit
Hmm.
at the expense of the general public. And I'm not talking about just the last 20 years or so. I think it may go back 100 years ago. Certainly during the progressive era, they were doing trust busting, so I'm sure there was stuff going on before that. But I really want to focus on the things that have happened since the early 1900s.
Yeah. I think America has a proud history, of course, on one level, but I think, like every other country, it's got a shameful history as well, with facts suppressed, political opponents prosecuted and persecuted. I think that it's alive and well today, just as it was more than 200 years ago. I think a lot is done in the name of the greater good, and a lot of that stuff that is done in the name of greater good is evil. I'll give you the final thoughts on that.
Um, well, and I think the evil parts have been covered up.
Yeah.
And not to tread on Woodrow Wilson's grave too much, but
Mhm.
it certainly could use some stomping.
Yeah.
I mean, right after he left office, there were all these attacks on Black communities.
Mhm.
Tulsa, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma is one, but I keep hearing about more and more. And I just find myself thinking, the Klan was resurrected. You had the scientific white supremacy. That aspect has been totally hidden for years.
Hmm.
How did that all play together? I tend to think that the people who supported a horrible philosophy based on evolution, the resistance for them were the people that didn't support evolution.
Yeah. Absolutely. Who knew what and when did they know it? Those are the questions to be asked and answered and researched and found out about. The name of the book we've been talking about today is History Uncovered, Revealing Hidden Truths. It is a thought-provoking book that explores how historical narratives are shaped, questioning who controls the story and why certain details are omitted. If you're curious about the lesser-known facets of U.S. history and their impact on our nation today, this is a book that'll open your eyes to the hidden truths. Brad, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you. It was wonderful being with you.
Wonderful having you on the show. I appreciate your time and your insight. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.